You open your eyes, and you're lying in a hospital bed. The air is cold, the lights flicker, and the corridor outside hums with an eerie silence. Machines long forgotten sit motionless, yet you swear you hear a heartbeat that isn't yours. Once, these wards promised recovery, but now they hold only whispers, shadows, and patients who never left. These are Britain's most unsettling haunted hospitals, where history refuses to rest. Friern Hospital. You lie in a hospital bed, staring up at a ceiling that seems too far away. The corridor outside hums with silence, but you can sense movement, a shuffle of footsteps, a faint breath that doesn't belong to you. The air is cold, damp, and carries the weight of a century's worth of fear. This isn't a hospital that heals. This is Friern Hospital, once known as the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, and one of the most unsettling medical institutions in British history. From the moment it opened in 1851, Friern was immense. Built to hold 1,250 patients, it quickly swelled to nearly 2,500, becoming the largest asylum in Europe. Its sheer scale was staggering, a vast sprawl of red brick buildings and corridors so long they seemed endless. Some said it could take an hour to walk from one side to the other, a journey through rooms filled with human suffering. To the outside world, it was an institution of care. But within, whispers painted a darker picture. Imagine the nights inside those walls, hundreds of patients, many with nowhere else to go, locked in overcrowded wards, the cries of the distressed echoing through the corridors, unanswered, staff overworked, orderlies stretched thin, treatments crude and often cruel. In an age when mental health was barely understood, Friern became a place of both confinement and despair. Its reputation quickly grew. Locals called it simply Colney Hatch, and the name alone became shorthand for madness itself. People whispered about the things they'd seen when the gates opened. Vacant stares from barred windows, hands reaching out through cracks, figures pacing endlessly along the grounds. Parents even used it as a warning. Misbehave, and you might end up in Colney Hatch. But it wasn't just the patients who left a mark. Staff, too, seemed to feel the weight of the building. Endless corridors, dimly lit wards, and the atmosphere of unbroken sorrow gnawed at them. Some claimed to hear footsteps following them when no one was near, or voices calling their names in empty halls. The hospital's vastness seemed alive, as though the very architecture held its own presence. Over time, deaths accumulated. Thousands passed within its walls, patients forgotten by family, buried in unmarked graves. Many believe those restless souls never left. The corridors became stages for ghostly encounters. Visitors spoke of doors slamming shut without reason, sudden cold drafts, and the sensation of unseen eyes watching from the dark. One story tells of a nurse on her night shift, making rounds through one of the older wings. She felt a tug on her uniform and turned, expecting to find a patient. Instead, she was met with empty air. Moments later, she saw a figure in the corner of her eye, thin, frail, dressed in hospital whites. She followed, only for the figure to vanish into a locked ward that hadn't been used in decades. By the late 20th century, Friern had become a relic of another era. Treatments were evolving, mental health care moving away from massive asylums toward community support. But the hospital remained, housing its dwindling patients until it finally closed in 1993. When the doors shut, many thought the story had ended. Yet, if anything, the atmosphere grew stranger. Developers transformed the site into luxury apartments, but the bones of the building remained. The endless corridors, though polished, still carried the memory of footsteps. Residents reported uneasy nights, sounds of pacing in the hallways, distant murmurs seeping through the walls. Some swore they saw fleeting shadows at the end of corridors that no longer connected to wards. The hospital might have changed its face, but its soul seemed intact. Urban explorers who slipped inside before the redevelopment described chilling scenes. Beds still lined the wards, paint peeling like old skin from the walls. Patient files, left behind in chaos, scattered across the floors. Graffiti scrawled over the surfaces, but nothing could mask the underlying weight of history. In one room, a crucifix still hung crookedly above the door, a silent witness to everything that had unfolded beneath it. And always, there were the whispers of the paranormal, voices captured on recorders, cold spots so sharp they burned the skin, figures glimpsed at the ends of halls, dissolving into nothing the closer you walked. One explorer recalled hearing faint cries echoing in an abandoned ward, each wail softer than the last, until it faded into silence, so complete it felt unnatural. What makes Friern Hospital so unsettling is not only its ghostly legends, but the history itself. Thousands of lives began and ended here, many in pain, many in isolation. Their suffering is embedded in the walls, soaked into the floors, imprinted in the air. When you walk its corridors, you're not just exploring an abandoned building. You're walking through decades of human despair, grief, and silence. And perhaps that's why so many believe the spirits linger still. Hospitals are meant to heal, but Friern became a place where hope was often lost. Its halls echo with absence, with lives forgotten and stories untold. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain. The atmosphere of Friern Hospital is heavy, oppressive, unforgettable. So if you find yourself near its old grounds, pause for a moment. Look at the grand brick facade, the windows still watching the world outside, and ask yourself, if walls could remember, what would these ones tell? And more importantly, would you really want to hear? Whitecroft Hospital. You walk up a hill on the Isle of Wight, and the outline of an imposing red brick building rises against the sky. At first glance, it could be any grand Victorian institution, its tall windows reflecting the light, its roofline sharp against the horizon. But this isn't a mansion. It's Whitecroft Hospital, once an asylum for the mentally ill, a place where thousands lived and died, and where some say they still remain. Opened in 1896, Whitecroft was built in the style of the era's ideal asylums. It was self-contained, a world unto itself. Farms provided food, workshops provided work, and the wards stretched out like the wings of a great machine. The intention, at least in theory, was rehabilitation, and patients would work the land, breathe the country air, and slowly recover. But the truth of life inside was far harsher. Overcrowding soon strained its walls. At its height, Whitecroft held more than 1,000 patients, many of whom had been sent there less for medical reasons than for being inconvenient. Women who defied social norms, men who fell into poverty, even those who simply spoke too much of their despair. Many were locked away behind its doors. Once admitted, escape was rare. The building itself seemed designed to isolate, Endless wards ran off into shadow, their high ceilings amplifying every sound, doors locked heavy and final, windows barred and clouded. Patients lived regimented lives, days punctuated by routine, nights by silence, broken only by sudden outbursts echoing down the corridors. For decades, Whitecroft was a hidden world of suffering that most outside never saw. And then, slowly, its reputation shifted. Staff began reporting things they couldn't explain. Shadows moving down corridors where no patients walked. The sound of footsteps echoing behind them in locked wards. Whispers in the empty air, faint but distinct. Some spoke of seeing nurses in crisp white uniforms, gliding silently through the halls, except these nurses belonged to another time. The stories persisted even after the hospital closed its doors in 1992. Developers turned the site into private flats, but the atmosphere didn't change. Residents described hearing voices in rooms that stood empty, doors opening on their own, and the unmistakable sound of someone walking overhead when no one lived above them. Some even claimed to glimpse figures in hospital attire, moving with the casual certainty of staff still on their rounds. One tale tells of a man returning late at night to his flat in the former hospital. As he climbed the stairs, he saw a woman in a nurse's uniform walk calmly along the corridor ahead, clipboard in hand. He followed, thinking perhaps it was a costumed visitor or a historical guide. But when he turned the corner, the corridor was empty. The nurse had vanished into thin air. Visitors, too, have reported unsettling encounters. Paranormal investigators describe sudden drops in temperature, their equipment flickering and failing as though drained of power. Electronic voice recorders have picked up faint responses, soft, clipped tones like medical staff taking notes. Some even believe the spirits here are not hostile, but simply continuing their duties, tending to patients who have long since gone. But the feeling of being watched is what most people remember. Walk the grounds of Whitecroft, and it feels as though eyes follow from every window. Stand in a former ward, and the silence grows so dense it presses against your chest. The past has weight here, and it is difficult to shake the sense that something is still moving just out of sight. The Isle of Wight itself is sometimes called the most haunted island in Britain, and Whitecroft is among its most infamous landmarks. Its transformation into modern apartments hasn't erased its history. If anything, it has forced the living and the dead to coexist. Residents may try to brush off their experiences as imagination, but the stories repeat too often, too consistently, to dismiss entirely. What makes Whitecroft so unnerving is the nature of its hauntings. They aren't violent, aren't dramatic. They are ordinary. Phantom staff doing ordinary things. Nurses on their rounds. Doctors making notes. Footsteps pacing corridors. It's as if the routines of the hospital became so ingrained in its walls that they still play out, endlessly, long after the hospital itself has gone. And that is what lingers in the mind. These weren't just ghost stories of shadows and screams. They were reminders of lives defined by routine, trapped in repetition, unable to move on. If the staff still walk the wards, perhaps the patients remain too, silently pacing, waiting for care that will never come. Hospitals are meant to heal, but Whitecroft became a place of confinement, its legacy one of sorrow. To walk there now is to feel caught between worlds, the modern life of apartments and gardens, and the ghostly echoes of a hospital that refuses to fade. And if you ever visit, pause at the entrance. Listen to the silence. If you're lucky, you'll hear nothing at all. But if you're not, you may catch the faint click of shoes on polished floors, the rustle of a uniform, the low murmur of a voice asking questions long forgotten. Because at Whitecroft, the staff never truly left. St. Thomas's Hospital. The building looks ordinary enough from the outside, its red brick facade weathered, its windows reflecting the grey skies of Stockport. Yet behind those walls, something lingers. This is St. Thomas's Hospital, a psychiatric institution that closed its doors in 2004, but has since become one of Britain's most notorious haunted hospitals. What sets it apart is not just the stories told in whispers, but the fact that its hauntings have been broadcast to the world. St. Thomas's opened in the 19th century, part of a wave of asylums built across the country to house the mentally ill. Like many of its counterparts, it promised care, but its reality was far grimmer. Overcrowding, experimental treatments, and years of human suffering etched themselves into its walls. Patients lived and died within its wards, their stories largely forgotten. By the time the hospital closed, its reputation was less of healing and more of sorrow, a place where the weight of history could be felt in every corridor. And then, the stories began to spread. Locals who wandered near the abandoned building after closure reported strange lights glowing in the windows. Long after electricity had been cut, shadows appeared to move inside empty wards. Some swore they heard screams carried on the night air, faint but undeniable. It didn't take long for the sight to draw the attention of paranormal investigators. In 2007, Most Haunted filmed here, bringing a national audience face to face with the mysteries of St. Thomas's. The crew entered with cameras, recorders, and skepticism. What they captured shook even them. In one corridor, faint whispers bled through their microphones, words impossible to decipher, yet too clear to dismiss as static. Doors rattled without cause. Cold spots formed so suddenly that breath frosted in the air. At one point, a crew member was shoved hard enough to stumble, though no one was near. The broadcast left viewers unsettled, and for many, it confirmed what locals already believed. St. Thomas's is not just haunted, it is alive with unrest. Urban explorers who dared to enter after its closure added to the legend. They described long, dark corridors where the air felt heavy, as if pressing down on the lungs. Dust-coated beds still lined the wards, and in some rooms, personal effects were left behind. Tattered clothing, forgotten files, fragments of lives abandoned in the hospital's rush to close. What unnerved them most was not what they saw, but what they felt. The constant sense of being followed, watched, tracked by something just out of sight. One explorer recounted standing in the surgical wing when the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Expecting to see his friend, he turned, only to find the corridor empty. The footsteps grew louder, quicker, as though rushing toward him. He fled, stumbling out into the night, swearing never to return. The most consistent reports involve apparitions. Figures in hospital gowns have been glimpsed wandering the halls. A tall man in a long coat, thought to be a doctor, has been seen standing in doorways, only to vanish when approached. Even more chilling are accounts of faces appearing in the windows, pale and hollow-eyed, staring out at those passing by. Locals crossing the grounds at night often stop in their tracks, convinced someone is watching them from inside. Yet when they look again, the face is gone. What makes St. Thomas's so unsettling is how quickly its hauntings revealed themselves. Many abandoned hospitals remain quiet for years before ghost stories spread. Here, almost immediately after closure, the legends began. Some suggest this is because the hospital was not simply abandoned. It was left in a kind of suspended state, the energy of its final days frozen in place. Equipment remained, wards intact, memories undisturbed. It is as though the hospital never fully shut down, as though its last patients and staff carried on in another, darker echo of reality. Even skeptics admit the building has an atmosphere difficult to dismiss. The silence inside is not natural. It is dense, suffocating, broken by sudden creaks and bangs that reverberate down the halls. Investigators who have spent nights there often describe an overwhelming dread, a sense that something is building, waiting, watching. Some theorize that the hauntings are the result of residual energy, emotions imprinted into the walls by decades of suffering. Others believe more intelligent presences linger, spirits aware of the living who intrude on their space. Whatever the cause, one fact is undeniable. The stories continue. New accounts emerge from every group who enters, each reinforcing the last. Today, St. Thomas's remains a magnet for thrill seekers and ghost hunters alike. Paranormal events are staged within its walls, and visitors consistently leave with tales of cold hands brushing their skin, whispers in their ears, and the uneasy feeling that they did not leave alone. Its legacy is no longer just medical. It is spectral, etched into British ghost lore. Standing outside the hospital now, with its windows dark and its walls crumbling, you can almost hear the echoes, a whisper carried on the wind, a shuffle of feet on the floor above, the creak of a door that should not be moving. And in that moment, you realize the truth. Hospitals may close, their patients may leave, but some places never stop breathing. St. Thomas's Hospital is one of them. Claybury Hospital. On the northern edge of London, hidden beyond the quiet suburb of Woodford Bridge, there lies a place that once dominated the landscape. Claybury Hospital. From a distance, its red brick towers rose above the trees like a fortress, visible for miles around. For over a century, it stood as one of the largest psychiatric hospitals in Britain. But ask anyone who lived near it, and they'll tell you. Claybury was more than a hospital. It was a presence. The story begins in 1893, when the asylum opened its doors. It was built on the Claybury estate, amid sprawling parkland and ancient woodland, isolated enough to keep its patients away from the bustle of the city. At first, it was hailed as modern and progressive, part of a wave of asylums designed to offer light, air, and routine as healing forces. It had its own farms, workshops, even recreation halls, an entire self-sufficient community behind its walls. But isolation breeds shadows. Soon, the reality of life inside grew darker. By the early 20th century, the hospital was overcrowded, with thousands of patients crammed into wards meant for far fewer. Treatments were crude by today's standards: electroconvulsive therapy without anesthesia, experimental medications, and long stretches of confinement. Many of the patients were not only the mentally ill, but also society's unwanted: the poor, the destitute, women considered hysterical, and men broken by war. To enter Claybury often meant to disappear. The corridors were vast, stretching away in endless lines, their tiled floors echoing with footsteps. At night, the sound carried strangely, as though the building itself shifted and breathed. Nurses spoke of walking their rounds and hearing whispers behind them, only to turn and find the hallway empty. Orderlies described shadows darting across wards where every patient was asleep, and patients, in their desperation, told of figures standing at the ends of their beds, watching, waiting, fading before dawn. As decades passed, tragedy piled upon tragedy. Hundreds died within the hospital each year, many buried in unmarked graves. The weight of that loss hung over the grounds, seeping into its very foundations. Locals began to avoid walking near the asylum at night. They swore they heard cries drifting from the woods, or saw pale faces at the windows, even when whole wings stood locked and abandoned. Even staff admitted unease. Some refused to work night shifts in certain wards, claiming the atmosphere grew unbearable after sunset. One former nurse recalled passing an open ward door and seeing a man standing inside, staring at her. She recognized him as a patient who had died the week before. When she blinked, the room was empty. By the late 20th century, Claybury's days were numbered. The asylum system across Britain was collapsing, replaced by community care. In 1997, after more than a century of operation, Claybury closed its doors. But its story didn't end there. Urban explorers who ventured inside in the years after closure described a building frozen in time. Beds and wheelchairs sat rusting in the wards. Patient files were scattered across desks, as if staff had simply walked away. Graffiti lined the walls, but beneath it, the weight of history pressed in. Many who entered swore they felt watched from the moment they crossed the threshold. Some heard footsteps following them through the long corridors. Others reported sudden, suffocating cold in certain rooms, cold so sharp it left their breath hanging in the air. Paranormal investigators soon followed, drawn by the hospital's sinister reputation. They captured recordings of faint voices, moans, and whispers impossible to trace. Cameras picked up shadows crossing hallways. More than once, equipment malfunctioned without reason. One team described a locked door rattling violently, as though something on the other side wanted out. Yet when they forced it open, the room stood completely empty. The surrounding woodland adds to Claybury's unease. The ancient forest, once part of the hospital grounds, is tangled with its own folklore. Visitors walking those trails speak of hearing screams echoing through the trees or seeing flickers of light bobbing between the trunks. Some say the patients' suffering spread beyond the hospital walls, staining the very land. Even today, walkers report a crushing sense of dread, as though eyes are following them from the darkness. What makes Claybury so unnerving is not a single terrifying story, but the accumulation of many small ones, footsteps in an empty hall, whispers the edge of hearing, shadows that vanish when pursued. They build a portrait of a place that does not rest, a place that refuses to let its past go quietly. Today, the hospital buildings have been converted into housing, part of a development called Repton Park. But the grandeur of the asylum still looms. The towers remain, the corridors reimagined as apartments, the woodland still pressing close around the grounds, and even residents there admit the atmosphere is strange. Some report unexplained noises at night. Others describe feelings of being watched in their own homes. The transformation has changed the face of Claybury, but not, it seems, its soul. Stand outside its gates at dusk, and the silence is unnerving. The wind stirs through the trees, and for a moment you might swear you hear a cry carried on the air. Look up at the windows, and you may see nothing, or you may see what countless others have claimed before. A pale figure watching, only to vanish when your eyes meet theirs. Claybury's legacy is not just in its history, but in its haunting. The isolation that once defined it still lingers, pressing down on the land. And as you walk away, one thought remains. In a place where so many lives ended in silence, perhaps silence itself is the loudest voice of all. Newsham Park Hospital. On the outskirts of Liverpool stands a hulking red brick structure whose very silhouette seems heavy with memory. Its windows, tall and arched, gaze down like watchful eyes. Its corridors stretch endlessly, dark and hollow. This is Newsham Park Hospital, a building with many lives and too many ghosts. It began in 1874 as a seamen's orphanage, a place meant to house the children of sailors lost at sea. For decades, its halls rang with the footsteps of boys and girls, their lives marked by discipline, hardship, and grief. Even then, stories began to cling to the building, children whispering of strange figures at the end of dormitories, or shadows passing across their beds. By the mid-20th century, the orphanage had closed, and Newsham was reborn as a hospital. During its years as a psychiatric institution, its reputation grew darker still. Patients filled the wards, many forgotten by the outside world. Treatments were often primitive, the care minimal. Suffering became part of the building's fabric, and when it finally shut its doors in 1997, Newsham Park was left to decay, its silence filled only by the echoes of its past. Step inside today, and the atmosphere is unmistakable. Paint peels from the walls like old skin. Rusting beds sit in rows, their frames twisted. Cabinets still hold patient files, names and diagnoses scrawled in fading ink. In the children's wing, dozens of small lockers remain, each with its own nameplate, reminders of young lives shaped by loneliness and loss. It is here that visitors say the air feels thick, pressing against the chest. Cold spots form without warning. Shadows stretch across walls, even when no light source explains them. And then come the sounds, footsteps pacing in empty corridors, doors slamming in abandoned wards, voices whispering so faintly you cannot tell if they are inside your head or just behind you. One of the most chilling locations in Newsham is the psychiatric wing. Former nurses have admitted that even when the hospital was active, they avoided it after dark. Patients claimed to see figures standing over their beds at night, and staff reported the sensation of being watched constantly. Paranormal investigators who have explored the wing since closure have described violent bangs, equipment failures, and, on more than one occasion, the sound of children crying where no children remain. The stairwells add to the terror. One in particular, narrow and iron-railed, is infamous. Many visitors report the feeling of being pushed while climbing it, as if unseen hands are determined to send them crashing down. Skeptics might dismiss it as suggestion, but the sheer consistency of the reports makes it harder to ignore. And then there are the apparitions. Shadowy figures have been glimpsed darting across hallways. Nurses in dated uniforms appear in doorways, only to vanish. Perhaps most unsettling are the childlike shapes seen near the lockers, lingering just long enough to suggest they are still waiting for a parent, for comfort, for release. Newsham Park's reputation has grown so notorious that it is now a staple of paranormal tourism. Ghost tours and overnight vigils draw crowds eager to test their courage. Some leave exhilarated, others shaken to their core. One group reported capturing faint voices on recorders, begging for help. Another fled when a series of doors slammed in sequence, as though something were moving through the ward toward them. Even hardened investigators admit that Newsham has an intensity unlike most sites. They describe it not simply as haunted, but oppressive, as though the building itself resents intruders. What lingers here is not easy to define. Perhaps it is the pain of generations of orphans whose lives began in grief and discipline. Perhaps it is the suffering of patients confined in their final years. Or perhaps it is something older, something born of the land itself, which has absorbed the sorrow of every soul who passed through its doors. Whatever the cause, the result is the same: an atmosphere so heavy, so suffocating, that few leave unchanged. Even in daylight, the dread persists. Walk the grounds, and you may feel the weight of unseen eyes on you. Peer into the windows, and you might glimpse movement in a ward long abandoned. And if you step inside at night, when the corridors stretch into blackness and the silence grows thick, be prepared for the sense that you are not alone. Newsham Park Hospital is more than brick and mortar. It is a vessel of memory, soaked with sorrow, sealed with silence. Its ghosts are not the kind that leap suddenly from the shadows. They are quieter, heavier, the kind that sit with you, breathe with you, and follow you long after you've left. And that is what makes Newsham so terrifying. Not what you see inside, but what you carry out with you. The feeling that part of the hospital has followed, that a fragment of its shadow has taken root just over your shoulder. So, if you ever find yourself standing before its looming red walls, ask yourself one question before you enter. Are you ready to leave a piece of yourself behind? Because at Newsham, the past doesn't just linger, it clings.